Oh, hello there. Yes, well, good grief. It is, isn't it? Very much so. Snow, for God's sake. Anyway, one has to always admire the godly spirit of shining on the UK, that whenever the government decides that energy bills need to go up or winter fuel payments aren't going to be made, is just guaranteed to have a cold snap in the weather. It's almost like God isn't real. Anyway, Yesterday, for a long period of time, yesterday afternoon, the lead story in both the Times and the Telegraph online was this particular young person who unfortunately lost their life in a terror attack in the US, which is dreadful. Intriguing that the Tesla truck is no longer mentioned at all because it doesn't quite fit the narrative, but that's another story. But hats off, most definitely, tipped hats to the Daily Telegraph, who actually had the audacity, one might say, in class terms, to post this: Royal Nanny's stepson killed in New Orleans terror attack. Which, sorry, I think that's slightly the wrong way round, one way or another, but carrying on, King, deeply saddened by death of Edward Pettifer, whose stepmother, Tiggy Leg Bork, looked after Prince William and Harry. Now, I think that personally that just speaks volumes about the nature of the British class system in so many different ways, that effectively the tragic death of a youngish person in America simply gets linked to a vaguely royal connection. Yeah, it doesn't make the death better or worse, but somehow cheapened, I think, with Tiggy Leg Bork. Is that possibly a real name? Anyway, from the sublime, perhaps, to the utterly ridiculous, we had this from Patrick O'Flynn, reposted by Alex Phillips, because she's always guaranteed to throw up something nasty. And this just really got my goat yesterday. Let's have a little read. Just thinking about all the girls who fell prey to jihadi rape gangs, and a point has occurred that I have not seen mentioned. I don't know if this point has occurred to him in his own particular voices in his head style, or if someone else has put it there. But either way, it's just out there. Many will have been immersed at school in wokery. Okay, that isn't actually a place in the West Country. Think about it. Telling them that even to be wary of somebody from a minority background in any context was bigoted. Now, as a teacher, I don't quite recognise that as a scenario, but I guess in Patrick's head, it's a thing, and Alex's, obviously. Hence, they may have had their natural instincts for self-protection disarmed by the state. And just have a think about exactly what kind of brain you have to come up with that as a reason why there are sexual violence inflicted on young women. Because, I don't know, it's just way out there. It's beyond anything that I can put into words in particular, but well done, Patrick himself. Anyway, well done, Alex, for reposting that to make sure that I get to see it. Anyway, the nuts and bolts of today are exactly on that kind of monumental nothingness that is a right-wing viewpoint on so many things at the moment. And obviously, when we think of absolute stupidity that people spout, noise, froth and nothingness all in one complete package, we come inevitably to Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, who was so proud of himself in the New Culture Forum that he actually sort of got himself posted up with some interesting music. Dear God, why does everything have to have music? I guess it's so the kids are down with it, in the same way that they wouldn't otherwise be down with Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, or perhaps, Nigel Farage, bearing in mind that they all worship Elon Musk and, by extension, Nigel Farage. Anyway, yesterday, yes, we did have this, okay? Threat to Britain is not from the far right, in inverted commas, it's from the far left and radical Islam. Our senior fellow, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, discusses the threat to Western values and freedom. Yes, senior fellow, which makes you think, well, okay, New Culture Forum, are there any non-senior fellows? No, of course not. It's just one of those organisations that likes to give people grandiose titles. One is put in mind of those trans organisations which have a total of 2 people in them, one of whom will be the Deputy Senior Head of Communication and Catering. Yeah? That kind of thing. They do like their titles, don't they? And of course Rafe really does, because he's a historian who has a great background in Burke's Peerage, which is where he basically is a database of people who've had babies that are rich and the gongs that they carry. It's basically an accountancy job, but he has managed over the years to keep saying that he's a historian. And if one goes to Amazon and looks up the historical books that he's done, one finds this and a couple of pamphlets that he's contributed chapters to in the New Culture Forum, because apparently the New Culture Forum isn't some very, very nasty right-wing Tufton Street group that accepts very, very, very dubious money from even more dubious charities with no question asked, but is in fact a publishing house. Anyway, it's worthwhile diving into this brief segment of Rafe in full flow, because it doesn't really matter what he's being interviewed about. He basically always simply says the same thing. And I want to unpack the extensive and deep historical argument that he comes out with. So let's dive in, shall we? Well, yes, here he is on GB News, perhaps inevitably, with the very lovely Dawn. It would be nice if Dawn brought some of that sort of Daily Star independence to some of her guests, but that isn't the business that GB News are in, or indeed that Rafe is in. So let's dive in and see what he's got to say.
Values, and they are under threat, but they're not under threat from this so-called far right. They're under threat from the far left.
Right, okay, yes, so, yes, there are civilised values, as opposed to presumably non-civilised values, whatever they are, I don't know. Answers on a postcard, folks, because civilised means various different things at various different times, and if you want to be very, very right-wing about things, of course, certain people are civilised and other people aren't, except the actual criteria for that does change over time, or historically, as the probably extensive historical library at the New Culture Forum definitely won't tell him. Yes, indeed. Anyway, under attack from the far left and, drum roll,
and from radical Islam.
Yes, you see, you have to link together the far left and radical Islam. And if anybody with a historical view of these things will, of course, tell you that the hard left, whoever that is, you notice there's none of that here. I guess I count as the hard left, but bearing in mind what he's going to go on to say, it actually seems to encapsulate something like about a quarter of the population. So I'm not really quite sure how hard left that is, even on a historical basis. Again, we'll come back to that point, and radical Islam, because of course everybody knows that hard leftists are always very, 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 very keen on religion historically. That thing, that historical thing that they've done historically. They've always historically done that. But Rafe, being the historian that he is, the massive head of history, no doubt, at, probably Tufton Street all told, is whatever. Just words, aren't they? They're just words. Let's move on.
These are mountains compared to the far right molehill. We have the most radically left-wing youth in history.
Right, okay then, yes, so, you see, you may recall all that historical period way back in, when was that? Oh yeah, July, when there were those riots, which was a whole bunch of people who well, apparently, as far as I can make out, historically, certainly according to Rafe anyway, there were people that were posting stuff online about how they had one or two very, very, very slight problems in and around radical Islam and the leftists and immigration, and then the Rosa came round and beat their doors in. And although there's film of them like throwing things at the police, that somehow didn't quite happen. Yes. Anyway, we have the most radical left-wing youth in history. Now, those of you of a certain age, or indeed of a certain ability to think, might think to yourself, well, I seem to recall that actually, back in the past, historically, young people have been quite radical. One might think of, for example, the various anti-Thatcher movements of the 1980s. One might think of the poll tax movement of the early 1990s. One might think indeed of the whole 1970s scene with like Rock Against Racism. One might think of 1968 and Grosvenor Square. One might think of, the 1950s CND movement. But apparently these things, this stuff is historical because, that's actually what there has been. Young people today are more radically left than that. Now, what Rafe is going to come on to, of course, is his own particular view of that. And what he really means by this is he's rather disappointed that young people don't share the same very true history, because he's a historian, don't forget, view that he has.
Never seen such extreme radical left-wing. More British youth think that protecting free speech is less important than not causing offence and stopping hate speech. And of course...
Right, yes, indeed. You see, young people growing up in, what we might call the world, and with their knowledge of it, actually have managed to decide that there isn't such a thing as free speech in the UK, which there isn't. We don't have free speech laws because we don't have a constitution, but that's the sort of thing that what's the word I might use? A historian might know, or indeed anybody that has a cursory understanding of the way that Rafe, actually Britain works. But I guess Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, with that enormously civilised name that he has, doesn't quite get that. Or maybe I'm just being, a little bit racist, eh? But that apparently, I think, according to Rafe, would be okay, because I would be exuding a sense of superiority, which is, of course, what he does with the things all the time. But here he's just saying nothing once again. British youth are concerned about people around them. Imagine that, eh? Imagine young people caring about what people's feelings are. Something that Rafe finds really alien, because he likes to live in a world where we can simply dismiss people out of hand. That's the kind of civilised values that he brings to the table.
Their definition of hate speech is so loose that it would encompass the everyday conversations of most viewers of this channel.
Yes, indeed, because of course we all know that the actual viewers of GB News effectively are boomers. They're people about my age, and they often are the most radically, let's use that word, shall we? They are the most radically far-right groups in society. No young person is going to watch GB News. I'm sorry, apart from those kind of very, very odd young Tories. They do throw up a few of them occasionally. There are a handful of them out there. Very, very strange individuals. I meet them occasionally in my job. I don't know, they are young Tories. There's always a certain percentage of them that are going to be young Tories. Some of them actually do believe this rubbish. But that's not realistically where the majority of people actually are, is it? And indeed, I would suggest strongly, as somebody who isn't a member of the radical left youth, but by definition, in Rafe's world, I am a Islamist supporting member of the radical left, or something. I would regard an awful lot of GB News' output as being hate speech. Yes, it meets the definition, Rafe, and you're one of the people that often contributes to it. Anyway, let's try and get to the end.
And at the same time, of course, vast swathes of British Muslim youth hold far more extreme and intolerant and undemocratic views than even their parents or grandparents.
Right, and this point is where I'm going to say, oh my God, Rafe, you have no evidence for that whatsoever. Let's assume by Islamic youth, okay, Muslim youth, let's assume that they're 20, okay? All right, yeah, let's assume they were born between 2005 and 2010. All right, okay? So these would be people who are British citizens, okay, let's just make sure about that, okay, who grew up in the shadow of the 9/11 attacks and all of the kind of enormous increase in anti-Muslim racism that we've seen in this country. Their parents, let's assume that their parents were 20 back in 2001, 9/11. Let's assume that their parents would have grown up as young people, again, against that background. So you have there two generations of people, okay? The youth, as he puts it, and their parents, who very much would have grown up with that kind of milieu, yeah? Yeah? And now, I would strongly suggest that anybody that doesn't somehow take on board the political aspects of that, especially in relation to the way that for the last quarter of a century, especially the British media, has presented Muslim views of the world as such. Think about all those daily shots we get of dead bodies in rubble. They are almost always of a particular religious persuasion, shall we say, but, you know, I guess that's Western civilization that we're bringing there, as ever, sending the gunboats in, metaphorically or otherwise, just to use that, you know, what's that word? Oh yeah, that historical view of it, yeah? And then take that back, again, another generation. Let's take that back to somebody maybe who came here, let's say in the 1970s from Asia, when, let's think about some of the things that were going on then, because you would have had, for example, the overthrow of the Shah, and you would have had that extremely positive, if you like, or negative, depending on your viewpoint, view of political Islam. But political Islam has been around for centuries. It's not a new thing. But of course, Rafe would know that, wouldn't he? He's a historian. He's a historian. And notice here as well, of course, that he has to, at all times, talk in these generalised terms, because he has to ignore all of those Muslims who seem to sit on the right place, who aren't radical. And yet, who exactly are the radical Muslims that he's talking about? I know that there have been at least 2 studies that have come out, oddly enough, of his mates from different organisations at Tufton Street, which have strongly suggested that, you know, young British Muslims have a very negative view of, for example, the British state in relation to the way that the British state views them. But then one might have to think about what exactly is the propaganda machine that is pumping this stuff out anyway. Like, I don't know, GB News, Astounding. Still, that's just me, I guess, not really understanding much about history, or indeed, you know, Tourist's Guide to London, or indeed how somebody who's involved in politics and is Muslim can or cannot be described as radical, even though it's exactly the same religious beliefs in real terms, and how exactly it is that I magically, as a very, very, very hardline atheist, can find myself, you know, supporting radical Islam. I don't know. I would be intrigued as to if anybody, Rafe in particular, could answer any of those questions. But of course he can't, because it doesn't really matter. He's not in the business of doing that, is he? He's not in the business of dealing with things as they were, history, or indeed things as they are. He's simply in the business of shunting a very, very nasty propaganda view of the world through any medium that he can. Still, being the stout, civilised English guy that he is, I suppose we'll just have to live with it, Anyway, do have a lovely one. Do stay warm. Please do. Dear God, do stay warm.